So my first theme here in Nova Scotia with respect to asset-based community development, first theme is don't just stand there, do something. In 1993, we had a government elected that had community economic development as a fundamental part of its platform. Dr. John Savage was the premier at the time, and we did stuff. I was lucky to come to the province around that time, and it was get on with it, boys. We established 14 regional development authorities. We divvied the province up into 14 areas, and we said to those authorities, here's a bunch of money. Here's some core funding. Municipal, provincial, and federal governments each provided a bunch of money. Go away, make a strategic plan. Sitting in the audience is Alan Sloan, who was one of the founding directors of one of these RDAs, and he did a brilliant job of community planning. What do you have, 20, 21 little groups running around? Talk about building assets. Alan worked on that. Government provided core funding, and we continue to do this 15 years later. These organizations, once thought of as kind of radical, are now part of the fabric. Some of them have done fabulous work. Some of them not so fabulous, but they're directed in the communities. At the same time, we looked around and said, geez, we've got to do something for some of these struggling marginal communities. Government set up the Black Business Initiative to encourage African Nova Scotian entrepreneurs to build and grow businesses. Government did a brilliant thing. We sent a group of African Nova Scotians around to consult with people. They came back with 46 recommendations. You've all seen government reports with recommendations. We implemented 45 of them. The only one we didn't implement, the group said, give us $5 million. So we couldn't do that. We gave them $1 million a year for 5 years. No strings attached. No need at the end of the year, if they hadn't spent the money, to give it back, which is something we government people, a luxury we don't have. The group that took charge of that money has spent that money way better than we in government could spend it. That agency is now 12, 13 years old and has morphed into doing all kinds of training, investing, supporting for the Black community. We also set up a small loans program. It was a complete failure. Government has no business lending money. We don't do it very efficiently. That's morphed into a support committee or support connection to the credit union movement. We use the credit unions. We guarantee 3/4 of their small loans. They guarantee 1/4. They've got some stake in the game, and they've done it much better than we have. We also set up something called the Community Economic Development Investment Fund, which is using tax breaks to help communities raise money locally to do projects locally. The proof of the success of that program, a couple of scam artists, I guess we can call them that now, in Cape Breton tried to set one of these things up. The local community said, we don't trust these guys. They couldn't raise the money. Now, government, we might have given those guys money, but the local community knew them well, knew their project was going nowhere, and voted by not giving them money. So the CEDIFs have had their successes, but they've also been really good at not doing stupid things. Always a good thing. My next point, I guess, is with homage to a song that Tim Broadhead may remember, the development set, the poem. The development set is something ennoble. It's something, and it's vision global. Somewhere in that song, there's a line that says, that works fine in practice, but does it work in theory? So having put a bunch of practice in place, one of our ministers said, we better put some policy around this stuff, which I think is the best way to do policy. Like, do a bunch of things, make some mistakes, learn some stuff, and then put the policy in place. So after all the regional development authorities were set up, a couple years later, we passed the Regional Community Development Act, which allowed government to do what it was already doing. And we kept that act. I wrote that piece of legislation, the first and only legislation I've ever written. It is the loosest legislation. All it does is say how you can start an organization, and there's one clause in there that says if the organizations aren't working, how government can shut them down. That got people a bit nervous. We've never had to use that clause, but basically it said go and do work. We also put together a growth strategy for the province called Opportunities for Prosperity. There hadn't been a growth strategy for a long time. We put that in place. And one of the things it promised was that we would have a community economic development policy. Not a rural policy, not an urban policy, a community economic development policy. We actually got that policy completed and passed through Cabinet in 2004. And that policy has been key to continuing some of our enabling work. And I want to read just 2 of the 11 principles on the policy. And the guy that pulled all those principles together is sitting in the second row, Jim Campbell. A whole bunch of us from about 25 departments were gathered, and we're all talking different languages. The health people are talking determinants of health, and the economic development people are talking money, and the agricultural people are talking, it was a crazy conversation. And Jim said, well, what are the principles? What are the principles at the base of this stuff? And the first principle is very simple. It says local leadership. The community plays a leadership role in its own development. Now, that doesn't sound to this audience very revolutionary, but when we presented it to Cabinet, they went, whoa, excuse me, it wasn't that government's job? No, the community's job to take responsibility for their own development. We didn't let government off the hook, though, because the second principle says government support. Government actively facilitates and supports community development through the provision of information, expertise, guidance, and other resources as appropriate. Note that money isn't listed there. We do provide some money, but opening the storehouse of information, for example, we've got something called community counts here in Nova Scotia. We can get data down to divide Nova Scotia into about 270 communities. You can get good data on incomes, population, all that sort of stuff. Very helpful for communities when they're trying to figure out where they want to go. So those are just 2 of the 11 principles. That policy has been really quite helpful, and there's interesting work being done, not only in information, on training, and all kinds of things, just to kind of help people figure out where they want to go. But one of the things we've learned through the work on the policy is, I guess, my third comment. But everything's connected to everything else. And you can't do asset-based community development from an economic perspective without banging into social issues, environmental issues, educational issues, cultural issues, the whole mess of things. And so what we've done since the policy came out, we put together a second economic growth strategy, a new version of the original one. The new one is called Opportunities for Sustainable Prosperity. And the sustainable word is the new one in the title, but it's absolutely crucial. What that policy is built on, that strategy is built on, is the assumption that you can't do economic development without being sustainable economic development, or without being good stewards of the environment. And you can't really fund good stewardship of the environment unless you have the resources. So the two are, it's not economy versus environment. The two have to be done together. And that, we built the policy, the strategy around reference to 5 capitals: financial, built, natural, human, and social. We've got some lovely diagrams, triangles, and so on. If I had 2 hours, I'd lead you through that. I don't, so I won't. We've put a bunch of other policies in place to kind of support that. And in 2007, the legislature passed the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act. Now, this is a piece of legislation that doesn't get nearly enough publicity, not only in Canada, but even here in Nova Scotia. But it sets targets for economic performance, and this is one I have to share this with you. Our goal in economic performance is to be above the average in Canada. We have a compelling goal. We want to be slightly better than average. But given that we're number 9 and number 10 of 10 provinces on most lists, that's a fairly stretch goal for us. But the beautiful thing is we have not defined economic performance yet. We know that it's not GDP per capita for 2 reasons. 1, the GDP doesn't measure what we want to measure, and 2, we're so low on GDP per capita, we'll never be at the average in Canada.